The lights in the television studio were bright, almost too bright, but Karoline Leavitt didn't mind. She had spent years preparing for moments like this. Sitting across from her was none other than Robert De Niro, one of the most famous actors in Hollywood. He looked calm at first glance, his hands resting on his knees, but if you paid close attention, you could see the faintest hint of tension in his jawline. Karoline adjusted her seat slightly, making sure she was comfortable. Her red blazer caught, the light just right, giving her an air of confidence that matched her mood. This interview wasn't just another assignment, it was her chance to prove herself. Everyone knew how hard it was to get De Niro to agree to interviews these days. He rarely spoke to anyone outside of promotional tours, so when Greg Monroe, the host of the popular talk show Late Night Live, offered her the co-host spot for tonight's episode, she jumped at the opportunity. Greg, a tall man with neatly combed brown hair and a warm smile, leaned toward the camera as the countdown began. 5, 4, 3. His voice trailed off as the red light on the camera blinked, signaling they were live. "Good evening, everyone," Greg said cheerfully, addressing the millions of viewers watching at home. "Tonight we have a very special guest joining us, none other than the legendary Robert De Niro." The applause from the studio audience filled the room. De Niro gave a polite nod, raising his hand briefly to acknowledge the cheers. "And also with us is Karoline Leavitt, one of the brightest rising stars in journalism today." Greg turned to her, his smile widening. "Karoline, great to have you here." "Thanks, Greg," Karoline replied smoothly. She glanced at De Niro, who offered a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Mr. De Niro, it's truly an honor to be sitting here with you." De Niro nodded again. "Nice to meet you," he said, his voice low and gravelly, the kind of voice that commanded respect without trying. For the next few minutes, Greg led the conversation, asking De Niro about his latest movie, a big-budget action film that had dominated the box office charts. De Niro answered confidently, sharing stories about working with the director and the challenges of filming some of the more intense scenes. Karoline listened intently, jotting down notes on her notepad. She didn't want to interrupt yet. She needed to ease into her role carefully. As the initial segment wrapped up, Greg gestured toward Karoline. "All right, let's bring Karoline into the mix now. Karoline, I know you've got some questions lined up for our guest." Karoline smiled warmly, setting her pen down. "Absolutely, Greg." "Thank you." She turned to De Niro, her expression shifting ever so slightly. It was subtle, but there was a new sharpness in her eyes. "Mr. De Niro, your career has spanned decades and you've played so many iconic roles. What do you think has been the key to staying relevant in such a competitive industry?" It was a safe question, one designed to keep things friendly while still probing deeper. De Niro thought for a moment before answering. "I think it's about staying true to yourself. You can't chase trends or try to be something you're not. People will see through that." Karoline nodded, absorbing his answer. "That makes sense, but I'm curious. How do you handle criticism? Over the years, you've faced your fair share of controversies, especially on social media. Does that ever affect you personally?" The question hung in the air for a second longer than expected. De Niro's eyebrows furrowed slightly, and he shifted in his chair. "Criticism comes with the territory," he said finally. "You learn to deal with it." Karoline pressed gently. "But does it ever bother you? For example, when people misinterpret what you say or take things out of context?" De Niro hesitated, his gaze flickering between Karoline and the audience. "Look, I don't read every single thing people write about me. If I did, I'd drive myself crazy." The response seemed rehearsed, almost dismissive. Karoline noticed it immediately. She decided to push a little further, sensing an opening. "Fair enough, but recently, there was quite a bit of backlash after your comments about Ryan Scott, the director of Shadowbound. Some felt you came across as dismissive of younger filmmakers. Do you stand by those remarks?" The change in De Niro's demeanor was immediate. His shoulders tensed and his lips pressed together tightly. For a brief moment, he looked like he might refuse to answer altogether. Instead, he leaned forward, his voice firmer now. Let me tell you something. I never said anything negative about Ryan Scott. Whoever told you that clearly doesn't know what they're talking about. Karoline remained composed, her face neutral. I understand your perspective, Mr. De Niro, but according to multiple reports, including statements from Scott himself, the disagreement stemmed from creative differences during pre-production meetings. Is that accurate? De Niro exhaled sharply, his frustration becoming more evident. Listen, I'm not going to sit here and argue over details that have been twisted beyond recognition. Let's move on, the audience murmured softly, sensing the shift in tone. Greg, sensing trouble brewing, quickly interjected. All right, let's pivot to something lighter. Karoline, do you have any fun questions for Bob? Karoline paused, her mind racing. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This was her chance to make an impact, but she also knew she had to tread carefully. With a slight adjustment of her posture, she prepared to dive back in, ready to uncover the truth. No matter where it led, Greg's attempt to lighten the mood fell flat. Karoline glanced at him briefly before turning back to De Niro, her expression unwavering. She wasn't going to let this moment slip away. This was what she had prepared for. Moments when the truth hung in the balance, waiting to be uncovered. Mr. De Niro, she began again, her voice steady and clear. I understand your frustration, but my goal here isn't to argue. It's to have an honest conversation. If there's been a misunderstanding, now would be a great time to clarify it. De Niro stared at her, his sharp eyes narrowing slightly. For a second, it seemed like he might soften, like he might offer some insight into the situation. But instead, he leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms tightly over his chest. You know what? I don't think I need to explain myself to anyone, especially not someone who clearly hasn't done their homework. The words landed like a punch. The audience gasped audibly, and even Greg shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Karoline, however, didn't flinch. She took a deep breath, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make her next move count. With all due respect, Mr. De Niro, she said, leaning forward slightly, my job as a journalist is to ask tough questions, and if you feel misrepresented, then this is your chance to set the record straight. That's why we're here, to give you a platform. Her tone was calm, almost soothing, but there was no mistaking the steel behind her words. De Niro uncrossed his arms and leaned forward, mirroring her posture. Are you saying I'm lying? He asked, his voice low and dangerous. No, I'm not accusing you of anything, Karoline replied quickly. But I do think it's important to address these controversies head-on. Your fans deserve to hear your side of the story. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension in the room was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. The audience watched silently, their eyes darting between Karoline and De Niro, unsure of what would happen next. Even Greg seemed frozen, his usual charm nowhere to be found. Finally, De Niro broke the silence. You know what? Fine. Let's talk about Ryan Scott. He came into that project with zero experience directing action films. Zero. And yet, he acted like he knew everything. Every suggestion I made, every idea I brought to the table, he shot down without even considering it. So yeah, maybe I got frustrated. Maybe I said things I shouldn't have. But don't act like I'm the bad guy here. Karoline nodded slowly, taking in his words. That's fair. Creative differences can be difficult to navigate, especially when two strong personalities are involved. But do you regret how things turned out? Do you wish you'd handled it differently? De Niro sighed, heavily, running a hand over his face. For the first time since the interview began, he looked tired, almost vulnerable. Of course I do. Nobody likes conflict. But sometimes you have to stand your ground. You can't always compromise. And that's understandable, Karoline said gently. But do you think the public backlash was justified? Some people felt your comments were dismissive of younger filmmakers trying to break into the industry. De Niro's eyes flashed again, and his earlier frustration returned in full force. You want to know what I think? I think people love to tear others down. They love to twist words and create drama where none exists. It's exhausting. Karoline tilted her head slightly, studying him. Do you think social media plays a role in that? Amplifying misunderstandings and turning minor disagreements into major controversies? Now it was De Niro's turn to pause. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, as if weighing his words carefully. Maybe, he admitted grudgingly, but it doesn't change the fact that people need to take responsibility for their actions. You can't blame everything on Twitter or Instagram. The audience murmured in agreement, sensing a rare moment of honesty from the usually guarded actor. Karoline seized the opportunity to dig deeper. So, looking back, is there anything you'd say differently? Any message you'd like to share with your fans, or with Ryan Scott himself? De Niro hesitated, his jaw tightening. For a split second, it seemed like. When the show returned from the commercial break, the atmosphere in the studio felt different. The lighthearted energy that usually filled the space was gone, replaced by an uneasy tension. Greg Monroe tried his best to steer the conversation towards safer topics, but it was clear that the earlier exchange between Karoline Leavitt and Robert De Niro had left its mark. "All right, folks, let's shift gears a bit," Greg said with forced cheerfulness, glancing nervously at both guests. "Bob, I know you've got some exciting projects lined up. Can you tell us more about what's next for you?" De Niro didn't respond right away. He sat stiffly in his chair, his jaw clenched, and his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. It was as if he were trying to ignore Karoline entirely, focusing all his attention on Greg instead. Finally, after a long pause, he spoke. "Yeah, sure. I've got a couple of things coming up. Nothing too big, just some work with independent filmmakers." His tone was flat, almost dismissive, and it was obvious he wasn't interested in discussing his future plans. The audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing that the storm hadn't passed yet. It was merely simmering beneath the surface. Karoline, however, wasn't ready to let go. She had spent years honing her skills as a journalist, learning how to navigate difficult interviews without losing her composure. This moment was no exception. As Greg continued asking generic questions about De Niro's career, she waited patiently for her chance to step back in. Finally, when there was a brief lull in the conversation, she leaned forward slightly. "Mr. De Niro," she began, her voice calm but firm. "Earlier, you mentioned feeling misrepresented by the media. Do you think part of the issue stems from how celebrities are portrayed in today's fast-paced news cycle? Or do you believe it's something deeper than that?" De Niro turned to look at her, his expression hardening instantly. For a moment, he seemed to consider ignoring her completely. But then, almost reluctantly, he responded, "It's not just about the news cycle. It's about people wanting drama. They don't care about facts or truth, they just want something to talk about." Karoline nodded thoughtfully, her pen moving quickly across her notepad. "That's an interesting perspective. But doesn't that put added pressure on public figures like yourself to be extra careful with your words? After all, one misstep can spiral out of control." De Niro's face reddened slightly and he gripped the arms of his chair tightly. "You make it sound so simple, like I should just tiptoe around every single thing I say. Well, guess what? That's not who I am. I speak my mind, and if people don't like it, that's their problem." The audience gasped audibly, and Greg looked increasingly panicked, unsure of how to diffuse the situation. Karoline, on the other hand, remained unfazed. She took a deep breath, choosing her next words carefully. "I'm not suggesting you shouldn't speak your mind, Mr. De Niro. Freedom of expression is important. But with great influence comes great responsibility. Don't you agree?" Her question hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. De Niro stared at her, his eyes blazing with anger. "Responsibility?" he repeated, his voice rising. "What about your responsibility? You sit there acting like you're some kind of authority on my life, judging me based on half-truths and gossip. How does that make you any better than the people you're criticizing?" The room fell silent. Even the crew members operating the cameras exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what would happen next. Karoline met De Niro's gaze steadily, refusing to back down. "My responsibility as a journalist is to ask tough questions and hold people accountable, including myself. If you feel I've crossed a line, I apologize. but I stand by the importance of having honest conversations, even when they're uncomfortable. Tio. Niro shook his head, his frustration boiling over. You're unbelievable. Completely unbelievable. He stood abruptly, knocking his chair backward with a loud clatter. The sound echoed through the studio, startling everyone present. I'm done, he declared, his voice sharp and final. Without another word, he turned and walked off the set, leaving behind a stunned audience and a bewildered Greg Monroe. For a few seconds, no one moved. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every moment of the chaos. Then slowly, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, growing louder as people realized they had witnessed something extraordinary and potentially career-defining. Greg cleared his throat awkwardly, attempting to regain control of the situation. Well, that was certainly unexpected. We'll be right back after this short break. As the show cut to commercial, Karoline sat frozen in her chair, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she had pushed De Niro too far, but she also knew she couldn't have backed down, not when the truth was at stake. Around her, the studio buzzed with activity as producers scrambled to figure out what to do next. Behind the scenes, Greg approached her cautiously. Karoline, are you okay? He asked, his voice tinged with concern. She nodded, still processing everything that had unfolded. I'm fine, she replied softly, but I think we both know this isn't over. He sighed heavily, rubbing the back of his neck. You're probably right. Whatever happens next, just stay ready. Little did either of them realize, the fallout from this interview would spread far beyond the confines of the studio. Within minutes of the broadcast resuming, clips of De Niro's meltdown began circulating online, sparking debates and dividing opinions across social media platforms. And Karoline Leavitt's name was about to become synonymous with courage and controversy. A chaotic television studio scene after a live interview meltdown. A young female journalist with short blonde hair sits alone at the desk, looking composed, but reflective, while the audience reacts with shock and murmurs among themselves. In the background, cameras are still rolling, capturing the aftermath of the incident. The set features bright studio lights and large screens displaying the show's logo, with an empty chair where the male actor had been sitting moments before. Part 4, 670 words. As soon as the commercial break began, the studio erupted into controlled chaos. Producers rushed onto the set, whispering urgently into their headsets while stagehands scrambled to adjust equipment. The audience, still buzzing with disbelief, exchanged wide-eyed glances and hushed conversations. Karoline Leavitt remained, seated, her hands resting calmly on the table in front of her, though her mind raced with thoughts about what had just happened. Greg Monroe leaned toward her, his face pale and worried. Karoline, we need to figure out how to handle this, he said quietly, glancing nervously at the empty chair where Robert De Niro had been sitting moments earlier. This is, well, it's unprecedented. Karoline nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. She understood the gravity of the situation. Walking off a live primetime show was unheard of, especially for someone of De Niro's stature. The fallout would be massive and unavoidable. We can't ignore it, she replied firmly. If we try to sweep this under the rug, it'll only make things worse. People deserve honesty. Greg hesitated, clearly torn between damage control and letting the story play out naturally. Finally, he sighed and nodded. You're right, but let's tread carefully. We don't want to pour fuel on the fire. The rest of the commercial break passed in a blur. Backstage, frantic phone calls were made to De Niro's team, but no one answered. Social media platforms were already ablaze with clips of the heated exchange, hashtags like "Saw De Niro Meltdown" and Karoline Leavitt trending worldwide. Memes mocking De Niro's abrupt exit flooded timelines, while others praised Karoline for standing her ground. When the show returned, from the break, Greg addressed the audience directly. Ladies and gentlemen, as you've seen, tonight's interview took an unexpected turn. While we respect Mr. De Niro's decision to leave, We also believe in open and honest dialogue. So Karoline, if you're comfortable, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what just happened. Karoline took a deep breath, composing herself before speaking. Thank you, Greg. First, I want to say that I have immense respect for Mr. De Niro's work. That hasn't changed. However, my role as a journalist is to ask tough questions and hold people accountable, even when it's uncomfortable. Tonight, emotions ran high, and I understand why Mr. De Niro felt the way he did. But I stand by the importance of having these kinds of conversations, especially in today's world. Her words resonated deeply with many viewers. Some applauded her professionalism and courage, while others criticized her for pushing too hard. Regardless of opinion, one thing was certain. The interview had struck a nerve, sparking widespread debate about accountability, media responsibility, and the pressures faced by public figures. By the time the show ended, the studio was eerily quiet. The audience filed out, still discussing the events in hushed tones. Karoline gathered her notes and stood up, feeling both drained and exhilarated. As she walked off the set, Lisa Carter, a fellow journalist and close friend, approached her with a mix of concern and admiration. Karoline, are you okay? Lisa asked, placing a hand on her shoulder. That was intense. I'm fine, Karoline replied, forcing a small smile. It's just a lot to process. Lisa nodded sympathetically. I can imagine. You know this is going to blow up even more once the full clip hits the internet, right? Karoline sighed, knowing Lisa was right. Within hours, every major news outlet would be covering the story. Late-night hosts would joke The days following the interview felt like a whirlwind for Karoline Leavitt. Every waking moment was consumed by the aftermath of what had happened on live television. Her phone buzzed constantly with calls, texts, and emails from people she knew, and many she didn't. Friends congratulated her, colleagues praised her bravery, and strangers either lauded or criticized her actions. It was overwhelming, to say the least. Karoline spent most of her time holed up in her small apartment, trying to make sense of everything. She sat at her desk, surrounded by papers and notes, staring at her laptop screen as countless notifications popped up. Social media platforms were ablaze with reactions to the interview. Clips of De Niro's Meltdown had gone viral, racking up millions of views within hours. Memes, think pieces, and heated debates dominated online spaces, turning her into both a hero and a villain, depending on who you asked. Lisa Carter stopped by one evening, bringing takeout and a much-needed pep talk. You've got to eat something, Lisa said firmly, setting down a bag of food on the cluttered desk. When was the last time you slept? Karoline shrugged, barely glancing up from her computer. I don't know. Maybe 2 days ago. I can't stop looking at all this stuff. People have so much to say, and it's hard not to feel like I messed everything up. Lisa sighed, pulling up a chair beside her. Karoline, listen to me. You didn't mess anything up. You did your job, and you did it well. Yes, it blew up, bigger than anyone expected, but that's not your fault. What matters now is how you handle the attention. Karoline leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. I never wanted this kind of spotlight. I wanted to be taken seriously as a journalist, not turned into some internet sensation. I get that, Lisa replied gently. But here's the thing. You are being taken seriously. People are talking about accountability because of you. They're debating important issues like media responsibility and celebrity culture. That's huge. Karoline nodded slowly, considering Lisa's words. She knew her friend was right, but it didn't make the pressure any easier to bear. Alongside the praise came harsh criticism. Some accused her of deliberately provoking De Niro for ratings, while others questioned whether she had crossed ethical boundaries. Anonymous trolls sent hateful messages attacking her appearance, her career, and even her personal life. Eric Dawson tried his best to shield her from the negativity. He installed privacy settings on her social media accounts and encouraged her to step away from the constant barrage of updates. You can't read every comment, he told her one night as they lay side by side on the couch. It's toxic and it'll drive you crazy if you let it. I know, Karoline admitted. Softly, But it's hard not to care when everyone seems to have an opinion about me. Eric wrapped an arm around her shoulders. You can't control what other people think. All you can do is focus on why you started this journey in the first place. 2. Tell stories that matter. His words stuck with her. Over the next few days, Karoline began shifting her focus. Instead of obsessing over the backlash, she decided to channel the newfound attention towards something meaningful. She reached out to her editor at the news station, pitching an idea for a podcast series called Truth Unfiltered. The concept was simple: honest conversations with everyday people facing systemic injustices, giving a voice to those who often went unheard. Her editor loved the idea and greenlit the project immediately. For Karoline, it felt like a lifeline, a way to remind herself why she had become a journalist in the first place. She threw herself into the work, conducting interviews with teachers fighting for better school funding, nurses advocating for healthcare reform, and activists pushing for criminal justice changes. Each story reignited her passion for journalism and helped drown out the noise of online criticism. Meanwhile, Robert De Niro remained largely out of the public eye. His initial apology had done little to quell the controversy, and his absence only fueled speculation about his mental state. Rumors swirled that he was taking a break from acting altogether, though his representatives denied these claims. A few weeks later, however, he resurfaced briefly to announce he would star in a small indie film directed by Rachel Meyer, a relatively unknown filmmaker known for her raw, emotional storytelling. Critics noted a shift in De Niro's demeanor during promotional interviews for the film. He seemed quieter, more reflective, and less combative than usual. When asked about the infamous interview with Karoline, he offered a brief but sincere acknowledgement. It was a tough moment for me, he admitted. I could have handled things differently. Sometimes we all need reminders to listen more and react less. While far from a full apology, the statement signaled a potential turning point for De Niro. Fans welcomed his humility, and early reviews of the indie film praised his performance as one of his most vulnerable roles to date. Back in her world, Karoline continued building momentum with Truth Unfiltered. The podcast quickly gained traction, resonating with listeners who appreciated its authenticity and depth. Offers poured in for speaking engagements, book deals, and even late-night hosting gigs, but Karoline remained cautious. She didn't want to lose sight of her mission amidst the chaos of sudden fame. One evening, as she recorded another episode of the podcast, she paused mid-sentence, reflecting on how far she'd come. The road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but she felt ready to face whatever challenges lay in store. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to smile, not because of the viral moment that had changed her life, but because she finally felt aligned with her purpose. Months had passed since the explosive interview with Robert De Niro, and Karoline Leavitt's life had transformed in ways she never could have imagined. What started as a single moment of confrontation had evolved into a platform that allowed her to amplify voices often ignored by mainstream media. Her podcast, Truth Unfiltered, became a beacon of hope for countless listeners who craved authenticity in storytelling. Each episode tackled pressing issues, from education inequality to climate change, featuring real people sharing their struggles and triumphs. The success of the podcast opened doors Karoline hadn't anticipated. Invitations flooded in for speaking engagements at universities, conferences, and community events. At first, she hesitated, unsure if stepping into the spotlight aligned with her values. But after careful thought, she realized these opportunities were chances to inspire others to seek truth and justice. So she accepted them, using each appearance to reinforce the importance of honest journalism. One evening, Karoline found herself standing on a stage in front of hundreds of people at a prestigious film festival. The organizers had invited her not only to moderate a panel discussion, but also to receive an award for excellence in investigative journalism. As she walked up to accept the honor, the crowd erupted into applause. Her heart swelled with gratitude, though she couldn't help feeling humbled by the recognition. "Thank you all for this incredible award," she began, gripping the microphone tightly. "But I want to be clear. This isn't just about me. It's about every person who has trusted me with their story. Without them, none of this would be possible. Her speech struck a chord with the audience, many of whom rose to their feet in admiration. Afterward, several attendees approached her to express how much her work meant to them. One woman, a teacher named Angela, shared how hearing stories similar to her own struggles in underfunded schools gave her the courage to advocate for change in her district. While Karoline basked in the positive impact of her efforts, she remained acutely aware of the challenges that came with her newfound fame. Anonymous threats persisted online, forcing her to hire security for public appearances. Some critics still accused her of exploiting the Niro incident for personal gain, though such accusations grew fewer over time as her dedication to meaningful storytelling became undeniable. Amid the whirlwind, Eric Dawson remained her steady anchor. He supported her through late nights spent editing podcast episodes and accompanied her to events when he could. "You're doing amazing work," he told her one night after a particularly grueling day. "Don't let anyone make you doubt that." "I know," Karoline replied softly, leaning against him. "But sometimes it feels like there's so much more to do. Like no matter how hard I try, it's never enough." "That's because you care," Eric said. "And that's what makes you great. Just don't forget to take care of yourself along the way." Karoline took his advice to heart, making a conscious effort to prioritize self-care. She started practicing yoga in the mornings, journaling before bed, and spending weekends hiking with Eric to clear her mind. These small rituals helped her stay grounded despite the chaos surrounding her. Meanwhile, Robert De Niro re-emerged cautiously onto the public scene. His indie film received critical acclaim, earning him praise for delivering a nuanced performance. Critics noted a newfound humility in his demeanor during interviews, suggesting that the earlier controversy may have prompted introspection. While he avoided discussing Karoline directly, he occasionally hinted at lessons learned from past mistakes. Their paths crossed unexpectedly when both were invited to participate in a high-profile charity gala. Karoline arrived feeling uneasy, unsure of how De Niro might react upon seeing her. To her surprise, he approached her during the cocktail hour, holding out his hand. "Kay." The film festival marked a pivotal moment for Karoline Leavitt, not just because of the award she received, but because it brought together two seemingly opposing figures, herself and Robert De Niro. Both had been invited to participate in various events throughout the week, culminating in a panel discussion about the evolving relationship between media and entertainment. When Karoline learned they would share the stage, she felt a mix of nerves and curiosity. Would their past clash overshadow the event, or could they find common ground? On the day of the panel, Karoline arrived early to prepare. Dressed in a navy blue blazer and tailored pants, she looked every bit the poised professional she had become. As attendees filed into the auditorium, she glanced around the room, spotting familiar faces from the journalism world and Hollywood elite alike. Her eyes landed briefly on De Niro, who sat quietly off stage, reviewing his notes. Their earlier conversation at the gala replayed in her mind, easing some of her apprehension. When it was time to begin, the moderator introduced both speakers to thunderous applause. Karoline took her seat at the center of the stage, smiling warmly as she acknowledged the audience. De Niro followed suit, his expression calm but guarded. Though neither spoke much before the cameras rolled, there was an unspoken understanding between them, a shared acknowledgement that this moment mattered. The moderator opened the discussion by asking each participant to reflect on how media coverage impacts public perception of celebrities. Karoline went first, speaking thoughtfully about the role of journalists in shaping narratives. "It's our responsibility to report facts accurately while also considering context," she explained. "But we must remember that behind every headline is a human being with emotions and experiences." Her words resonated with the audience, drawing nods of agreement. When it was De Niro's turn to speak, he surprised everyone by echoing her sentiment. "Actors are often put on pedestals, but we're not invincible," he admitted. "Criticism comes with the job, sure, but sometimes it feels like people forget we're just trying to tell stories, just like anyone else." The comment elicited murmurs of approval from the crowd, signaling a shift in tone. For the next hour, the discussion flowed smoothly, touching on topics ranging from social media's influence to the importance of accountability in storytelling. Karoline and Niro found themselves agreeing more than disagreeing, their mutual respect evident in their interactions. At one point, the moderator posed a question directly related to their infamous interview. "Karoline, Robert, your encounter last year sparked widespread debate about holding public figures accountable. Looking back, what lessons have you taken away from that experience?" Karoline hesitated for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "I think the key takeaway for me has been the importance of listening, not just asking questions, but truly hearing the answers. Journalism isn't just about exposing wrongdoing. It's about fostering dialogue and understanding." Niro nodded slowly, adding his perspective. "For me, it was a reminder that growth often comes from discomfort. I didn't handle things well that night, but it pushed me to reflect on how I communicate, not just with reporters, but with everyone around me." Their candid responses earned a standing ovation from the audience, many of whom were moved by the sincerity of their remarks. Backstage after the event, several attendees congratulated them on setting aside differences to deliver such a powerful message. Later that evening, during a private dinner hosted by the festival organizers, Karoline found herself seated next to Niro once again. This time, their conversation flowed naturally, free of tension or awkwardness. They discussed everything from favorite films to personal challenges, discovering unexpected similarities along the way. "You've done incredible work with your podcast," Niro said at one point, raising his glass in a toast. "It takes guts to tackle tough subjects like that." "Thank you," Karoline replied, touched by the compliment. "And thank you for trusting me enough to move past what happened between us. It means a lot." As the night drew to a close, Karoline reflected on how far they'd both come since that fateful interview. What began as a clash of egos had transformed into a lesson in humility and empathy, for Niro, for herself, and for anyone watching. The experience reinforced her belief that even in moments of conflict, there is always potential for connection and growth. By the time she returned home, Karoline felt a renewed sense of purpose. She continued expanding Truth Unfiltered, using her platform to highlight underrepresented voices and spark meaningful conversations. Meanwhile, Niro embraced a quieter phase of his career, focusing on passion projects that challenged him, creatively and personally. Though their lives diverged once again, the bond they forged at the festival remained symbolic of something greater, proof that even the most unlikely relationships can lead to profound change. And for Karoline, it served as a reminder that truth and understanding will always prevail when approached with courage and compassion. Months after the film festival, Karoline Leavitt's life reached new heights. Her podcast, Truth Unfiltered, had grown into a cultural phenomenon, earning accolades from critics and listeners alike. It wasn't just about the stories she told. It was about the impact those stories had on people. Teachers, nurses, activists, and everyday individuals found courage in her words, inspired to speak up and make changes in their own communities. For Karoline, this was the ultimate reward. One evening, she attended a prestigious journalism awards ceremony, where she was set to receive the Voice of Integrity Award, a lifetime achievement honor typically reserved for seasoned reporters. As her name was called, she walked onto the stage to thunderous applause, her heart swelling with gratitude. Standing behind the podium, she looked out at the sea of faces, friends, colleagues, mentors, and took a deep breath. "Thank you all for this incredible honor," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "But I want to dedicate this award to every person who has trusted me with their story. Without them, none of this would be possible." She paused, glancing down at her notes before continuing. "When I started my career, I never imagined I'd end up here. I just wanted to tell the truth, to shine a light on issues that matter. Along the way, I faced challenges, made mistakes, and learned lessons I'll carry with me forever." Her thoughts drifted briefly to that fateful night with Robert Niro. What had seemed like a disaster at the time had ultimately shaped her into the journalist she was today. It taught her resilience, empathy, and the importance of staying true to her values no matter the cost. She smiled softly as she thought of Niro, whose humility during their reconciliation had left a lasting impression on her. "I've often been asked if I regret pushing certain boundaries," she continued, addressing the audience directly. "The answer is no. Growth rarely happens without discomfort, for me, for the people I interview, and even for the public figures I hold accountable. But accountability isn't about tearing someone down. It's about creating space for understanding and change." Her speech earned a standing ovation, with many attendees moved to tears. Among them was Lisa Carter, who wiped her eyes as she clapped enthusiastically. Eric Dawson, seated beside her, grinned proudly, knowing how far Karoline had come since their early days together. In the months that followed, Karoline expanded her efforts beyond the podcast. She partnered with schools to teach students the art of investigative journalism, emphasizing the importance of ethics and integrity. She collaborated with nonprofits to amplify grassroots movements, ensuring marginalized voices were heard on larger platforms, and she published a memoir detailing her journey, from the highs of viral fame to the lows of online harassment, all while staying grounded in her mission. Meanwhile, Robert De Niro continued working quietly on projects close to his heart. His indie film gained traction at international festivals, earning him praise for its authenticity and emotional depth. Critics noted a shift in his performances, describing them as more introspective and vulnerable than ever before. Though he rarely spoke publicly about his personal growth, those closest to him recognized the changes, the way he listened more, reacted less, and approached conflicts with patience rather than anger. Their paths crossed one final time when both were invited to speak at a global media summit. This time there was no tension, only mutual respect. During a panel discussion, they reflected on the role of accountability in storytelling, agreeing that honesty and empathy must go hand in hand. As the event concluded, De Niro pulled Karoline aside. "You've done something remarkable," he said sincerely. "Not just with your work, but with how you handled everything that came your way. You've inspired a lot of people, including me." Karoline felt a lump rise in her throat. "That means so much coming from you," she replied. "I hope we can keep showing others that even difficult conversations can lead to growth." By the end of the year, Karoline's influence extended far beyond journalism. She became a symbol of courage and perseverance, proving that one person's dedication to truth could spark widespread change. Her podcast continued breaking barriers, and her advocacy work inspired countless others to take action in their own lives. As she sat in her apartment one quiet evening, reflecting on everything she'd accomplished, Karoline realized something profound. The Joe